The night was cold, and the shelter was full. People huddled together, some wrapped in thin blankets, others leaning against the walls, lost in their thoughts. A few whispered among themselves, sharing stories of how they ended up here. Then, a man walked in. He didn't look like he belonged. Not because he seemed too clean or too out of place, but because he carried himself differently. He was calm, observant. He wore a simple jacket, jeans, and sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth. At first, no one paid much attention to him. New faces showed up at the shelter all the time. Some stayed for a night, some for weeks, and others disappeared, never to be seen again. But this man wasn't looking for a place to sleep. He didn't grab a meal. He didn't ask for help. He just walked slowly, scanning the room, listening. A few people glanced at him, curious but uninterested. The shelter had seen all kinds: runaways, veterans, families who had lost everything. A stranger wasn't unusual. A woman near the door finally spoke. "First time here?" The man nodded but didn't say much. Instead, he kept moving, watching the volunteers work, watching the people eat, watching the tired faces of those who had given up hope. Some whispered about him. Was he lost? A journalist? Maybe a cop? No one guessed the truth. He made his way to a quiet corner and leaned against the wall, taking everything in. Then, after what felt like forever, he spoke. "What do you wish for the most?" His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. The room fell silent. The silence stretched for a few moments. Some glanced at each other, unsure how to respond to the stranger's question. Then, life inside the shelter resumed. People turned back to their meals, conversations, or their own thoughts. The billionaire kept watching, his eyes moving from person to person, absorbing their reality. The shelter was overcrowded. Every cot was taken. Some people sat on the floor, leaning against the walls, trying to rest. The smell of soup filled the air. A simple meal, the best the volunteers could offer with the limited supplies they had. A middle-aged man sat at one of the tables, staring at his empty coffee cup. His clothes were worn, his hands rough from years of labor. He used to be a construction worker before an injury left him jobless. No savings, no support, just bad luck. Near him, a young woman fed a small child. She looked no older than 20, but her eyes carried exhaustion far beyond her years. She had left an abusive home, escaping with nothing but her baby and the clothes on her back. A group of older men sat near the back, playing cards with a deck that was falling apart. They joked and laughed, but underneath, there was something else. Resignation. They had been here the longest, and deep down, they knew they might never leave. A volunteer rushed by, handing out blankets. "We're running low," she told another worker. "Not sure if we'll have enough for tomorrow." The billionaire listened. He heard it all, the unspoken fears, the quiet struggles. He finally spoke again, his voice steady but curious. "If you could have one thing to change your life, what would it be?" A few heads turned. Some ignored him. Others, for the first time, really looked at him. The question lingered in the air. A few people exchanged glances, unsure if he was serious. An older man sitting near the entrance chuckled. His clothes were layered, mismatched, and his beard was untrimmed. He looked up from his cup of coffee, shaking his head. "One thing? You got a magic wand or something?" he asked, his voice rough but amused. The billionaire smiled slightly but said nothing. He waited. A young man near the window spoke first. His hoodie was too thin for the cold, and his hands trembled slightly. "A job," he said. "Something real, not a temp thing, not a handout, a real job." A woman sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, mumbled, "A home." She didn't look up when she said it. Another voice came from the back. "A second chance." The billionaire nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Some still thought he was joking. A few ignored him completely, too tired or too used to disappointment to entertain the idea. Then the skeptical man laughed again. "Listen, pal, nobody here expects miracles. You think one thing can change everything? Some of us have been stuck for years." He gestured around the room. "We've heard all the speeches, we've seen people come and go, ain't nothing gonna fix this in a day." The billionaire turned toward him. His eyes were steady, thoughtful. "What if it could?" he asked. The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Then I'd ask for a life I don't have to fight for every single day." The billionaire studied him for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. "All right," he said. "Let's make it happen." A hush fell over the shelter. The billionaire's words didn't make sense at first. Make it happen? The skeptical man narrowed his eyes. What does that mean? The billionaire stepped forward, his voice calm but certain. It means I'm going to give everyone here exactly what they need to change their life. A few people laughed, shaking their heads. Others stared, waiting for the catch. Promises like this weren't new. People had come through before, handing out speeches, talking about hope, but nothing ever really changed. A woman standing by the food line crossed her arms. You serious? She asked. The billionaire nodded. 100%. Silence. Then someone scoffed. So what? You handing out cash? The billionaire shook his head. Money isn't always the answer. Some of you need jobs, some need a home, some need a fresh start. He looked around. Tell me what you need and I'll make it happen. The young man who had asked for a job spoke up. You're saying you could get me hired somewhere? Just like that? Yes, the billionaire said without hesitation. And not just anywhere. I own several companies. If you're willing to work, I'll place you. A woman, clutching her coat tightly around her, stepped forward. And housing? I'll cover your rent for a year, he said. Somewhere safe, somewhere stable. A murmur spread through the crowd. The skeptical man crossed his arms. And what's in it for you? The billionaire smiled. Nothing. Just the chance to see lives change. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in the room. Hope. Slowly, one by one, people started to step forward. One by one, people stepped forward. At first, cautiously. Then, with more confidence. The young man who had asked for a job stood tall. I'll take that offer, he said. The billionaire nodded. You'll start next week. I'll personally connect you with my hiring team. What's your skill set? I worked in warehouses before, the young man replied. I can lift, pack, whatever's needed. Done, the billionaire said. A full-time position, decent pay, benefits included. The young man blinked as if waiting for the catch. But there wasn't one. A single mother stepped forward, holding her toddler close. You said housing? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The billionaire nodded. You'll have a safe apartment, rent-free for a year. After that, I'll set you up with a financial planner to help you stay on your feet. Tears filled her eyes. She covered her mouth, nodding quickly. A man in his 50s wearing a tattered coat hesitated before speaking. I was a mechanic, lost everything when my shop shut down. The billionaire smiled. Would you run your own shop again if you had the chance? The man exhaled sharply as if the idea had never felt real before. Of course, he said. Then I'll fund it, the billionaire said. New tools, a rented space, everything you need to restart. People started whispering now, the energy in the shelter shifting. One by one, they came forward. Requests poured in. Some needed jobs, some housing, some training, and for every request, the billionaire had an answer. The skeptical man stood in the corner, arms still crossed. He watched, eyes narrowing, but for once, he had nothing to say. The shelter felt different now. The usual heaviness in the air had lifted, replaced by something unfamiliar. Excitement. A young woman who had been silent all night wiped her eyes. I can't believe this, she whispered. Things like this don't happen. A man who had just been promised a job shook his head in disbelief. This is real, right? He asked. You're not just saying this? The billionaire met his gaze. It's real, he said simply. People started reacting in different ways. Some sat in stunned silence trying to process what had just happened. Others broke down, overwhelmed by emotions they had long buried. A few even laughed, not out of amusement, but out of shock. The single mother, still holding her child, dropped to her knees. I don't know how to thank you, she said, voice shaking. You don't have to. The billionaire replied gently. Just take this chance and build the life you deserve. Near the back, the skeptical man watched it all. His arms were still crossed, his expression unreadable, but his posture had changed. He wasn't as tense. Finally, he exhaled and spoke. I don't get it, he muttered. Why? The billionaire turned to him. Why not? The skeptical man let out a bitter laugh. Because nobody gives something for nothing. The world doesn't work like that. The billionaire studied him for a moment. It should, he said. The room was quiet again. People had come in that night expecting nothing more than a meal and a place to sleep. Now, for the first time in a long time, they had something else. A future. The skeptical man leaned against the wall, arms still crossed. He had seen promises before. Empty words from people who meant well but never followed through. This felt different, but he still couldn't believe it. Finally, he asked, "Why are you doing this? What's in it for you?" The billionaire's expression softened. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his posture relaxed. "Because I know what it's like to have nothing," he said. The room fell silent again. "I wasn't born rich," he continued. "I grew up with nothing. No connections, no safety net. I spent nights on the streets just like some of you. I know what it's like to be hungry, to feel invisible." A few people exchanged glances. They hadn't expected this. The billionaire looked around the shelter. "People helped me when they didn't have to. A stranger gave me my first job. Another let me sleep on their couch when I had nowhere else to go. If they hadn't, I wouldn't be here." His voice was calm, steady. "Now, I get to do the same for you." The skeptical man narrowed his eyes. "And that's it? No catch?" "No catch," the billionaire said. "Just one thing." The man tensed. "Knew there was something," he muttered. The billionaire leaned forward. "When you get back on your feet, help someone else. That's all I ask." Silence. The skeptical man didn't respond right away. He looked down, deep in thought. For the first time that night, his arms unfolded, his posture less guarded. He wasn't convinced yet. But something inside him had shifted. And the billionaire noticed. Days passed. Then weeks. The shelter, once a place of quiet struggle, began to change. People who had spent years stuck in the same cycle were leaving. This time, not because they were forced to, but because they had somewhere to go. The young man who had asked for a job showed up in a crisp uniform, ready for his first day of work. He had a nervous but determined look in his eyes. "I won't mess this up," he told the billionaire when they crossed paths again. "You won't," the billionaire said, with certainty. The single mother moved into a small but warm apartment. She sent a picture to one of the shelter volunteers, the first home her child would remember. "He finally has his own bed," she wrote. The former mechanic stood in front of his new shop, staring at the sign with his name on it. His hands shook as he turned the key for the first time. "I never thought I'd get back here," he admitted. And yet, here he was. The shelter volunteers noticed the change too. "I've never seen so many people move on this fast," one of them said. "It's like they actually have a shot this time." The billionaire didn't come back to the shelter often. He didn't need to. The seeds he had planted were already growing. But one night, the skeptical man sat outside, staring at the city lights. He still came to the shelter sometimes, not because he needed to, but because he wasn't sure where else to go. The billionaire had left him his number. "When you're ready," he had said, "call me." The man stared at the number on the card, thinking. For the first time in years, he considered making that call.